Section 5 of About Orchids, a Chat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Yearsley. About Orchids, a Chat by Frederick Boyle. Chapter 4. Cool Orchids. This is a subject which would interest every cultured reader, I believe, every householder at least, if he could be brought to understand that it lies well within the range of his practical concerns. But the public has still to be persuaded. It seems strange to the expert that delusions should prevail when orchids are so common and so much talked of, but I know by experience that the majority of people, even among those who love their garden, regard them as fantastic and mysterious creations designed to all seeming for the greater glory of pedants and millionaires. I try to do my little part, as occasion serves, in correcting this popular error and spreading a knowledge of the facts. It is no less than a duty. If every human being should do what he can to promote the general happiness, it would be downright wicked to leave one's fellow men under the influence of hallucinations that debar them from the most charming of quiet pleasures. I suspect also that the misapprehension of the public is largely due to the conduct of experts in the past. It was a rule with growers formerly, avowed among themselves, to keep their little secrets. When Mr. B.S. Williams published the first edition of his excellent book 40 years ago, he fluttered his colleagues sadly. The plain truth is that no class of plant can be cultivated so easily, as none are so certain to repay the trouble, as the cool orchids. Nearly all the genera of this enormous family have species which grow in a temperate climate, if not in the temperate zone. At this moment, in fact, I recall but two exceptions, Vanda and Phalaenopsis. Many more there are, of course. Half a dozen have occurred to me while I wrote the last 6 words. But in the small space at command I must cling to generalities. We have at least 100 genera which will flourish anywhere, if the frost be excluded. And as for species, a list of 2,000 would not exhaust them, probably. But a reasonable man may content himself with the great classes of Odontoglossum, Oncidium, Cypripedium, and Lycaste. Among the varieties of these, which no one has ventured to calculate perhaps, he may spend a happy existence. They have every charm, foliage always green, a graceful habit, flowers that rank among the masterworks of nature. The poor man who succeeds with them in his modest bit of glass has no cause to envy Dives his flaunting Cattleyas and foxbrush Irides. I should like to publish it in capitals, that 9 in 10 of those suburban householders who read this book may grow the loveliest of orchids, if they can find courage to try. Odontoglossums stand first, of course. I know not where to begin the list of their supreme merits. It will seem perhaps a striking advantage to many that they burst into flower at any time, as they chance to ripen. I think that the very perfection of culture is discounted somewhat in this instance. The gardener who keeps his plants at the ne plus ultra stage brings them all into bloom within the space of a few weeks. Thus, in the great collections, there is such a show during April, May, and June as the gardens of paradise could not excel, and hardly a spike in the cool house for the rest of the year. At a large establishment this signifies nothing. When the Odontoglossums go off, other things come on with equal regularity. But the amateur, with his limited assortment, misses every bloom. He has no need for anxiety with this genus. It is their instinct to flower in spring, of course, but they are not pedantic about it in the least. Some tiny detail overlooked here and there, absolutely unimportant to health, will retard florescence. It might very well happen that the owner of a dozen pots had one blooming every month successively, and that would mean 2 spikes open, for with care most Odontoglossums last above 4 weeks. Another virtue, shared by others of the cool class in some degree, is their habit of growing in winter. They take no rest. All the year round their young bulbs are swelling, graceful foliage lengthening, roots pushing, until the spike demands a concentration of all their energy. But winter is the most important time. I think any man will see the peculiar blessing of this arrangement. It gives interest to the long dull days, when other plant life is at a standstill. It furnishes material for cheering meditations on a Sunday morning. Is that a trifle? And at this season the pursuit is joy unmixed. We feel no anxious questionings as we go about our daily business, whether the placens uxor forgot to remind Mary when she went out to pull the blinds down, whether Mary followed the instructions if given, whether those confounded patent ventilators have snapped to again. Greenfly does not harass us. One syringing a day and one watering per week suffice. Truly these are not grave things, but the issue at stake is precious. We enjoy the boon of relief proportionately. Very few of those who grow Odontoglossums know much about the trade, or care, seemingly. It is a curious subject, however. The genus is American exclusively. It ranges over the continent from the northern frontier of Mexico to the southern frontier of Peru, excepting, to speak roughly, the empire of Brazil. This limitation is odd. It cannot be due to temperature simply, for upon the one hand we receive Sophronitis, a very cool genus, from Brazil, and several of the coolest Cattleyas. Upon the other, Odontoglossum Roezlii, a very hot species, and O. vexillarium, most decidedly warm, flourish up to the boundary. Why these should not step across, even if their mountain sisters refuse companionship with the Sophronitis, is a puzzle. Elsewhere, however, they abound. Collectors distinctly foresee the time when all the districts they have worked up to this will be exhausted, but South America contains a prodigious number of square miles, and a day's march from the track carries one into terra incognita. Still, the end will come. The English demand has stripped whole provinces, and now all the civilized world is entering into competition. We are sadly assured that Odontoglossums carried off will not be replaced for centuries. Most other genera of orchid propagate so freely that wholesale depredations are made good in very few years. For reasons beyond our comprehension as yet, the Odontoglossums stand in different case. No one in England has raised a plant from seed. That we may venture to say definitely. Mr. Cookson and Mr. Veitch, perhaps others also, have obtained living germs, but they died incontinently. Frenchmen, aided by the climate, have been rather more successful. Messrs. Bleu and Moreau have both flowered seedling Odontoglots. M. Jacob, who takes charge of M. Edmund de Rothschild's orchids at Armainvilliers, has a considerable number of young plants. The reluctance of Odontoglots to propagate is regarded as strange. It supplies a constant theme for discussion among orchidologists. But I think that if we look more closely, it appears consistent with other facts known. For among importations of every genus but this and Cypripedium, a plant bearing its seed capsules is frequently discovered. But I cannot hear of such an incident in the case of Odontoglossums. They have been arriving in scores of thousands, year by year, for half a century almost, and scarcely anyone recollects observing a seed capsule. This shows how rarely they fertilize in their native home. When that event happens, the Odontoglossum is yet more prolific than most, and the germs, of course, are not so delicate under the natural conditions. But the moral to be drawn is that a country once stripped will not be reclothed. I interpolate here a profound observation of Mr. Yearsley. That wonderful man remarked that Odontoglossums grow upon branches 30 feet above the ground. It is rare to find them at 35 feet, rarer at 25 feet. At greater and less heights they do not exist. Here, doubtless, we have the secret of their reluctance to fertilize, but I will offer no comments, because the more one reflects, the more puzzling it becomes. Evidently the seed must be carried above and must fall below that limit, under circumstances which, to our apprehension, seem just as favourable as those at the altitude of 30 feet. But they do not germinate. Upon the other hand, Odontoglossums show no such daintiness of growth in our houses. They flourish at any height, if the general conditions be suitable. Mr. Yearsley discovered a secret nevertheless. and in good time we shall learn further. To the Royal Horticultural Society of England belongs the honour of first importing orchids methodically and scientifically. Messrs. Weir and Fortune, I believe, were their earliest employees. Another was Theodor Hartwig, who discovered Odontoglossum crispum Alexandræ in 1842, but he sent home only dried specimens. From these Lindley described and classed the plant, aided by the sketch of a Spanish or Peruvian artist, Tagala. A very curious mistake Lindley fell into on either point. The scientific error does not concern us, but he represented the colouring of the flower as yellow with a purple centre. So Tagala painted it, and his drawing survives. It is an odd little story. He certainly had Hartwig's bloom before him, and that certainly was white. But then again, yellow Alexandræs have been found since that day. To the Horticultural Society we are indebted, not alone for the discovery of this wonder, but also for its introduction. John Weir was travelling for them when he sent living specimens in 1862. It is not surprising that botanists thought it new after what has been said. As such, Mr. Bateman named it after the young Princess of Wales, a choice most appropriate in every way. Then a few wealthy amateurs took up the business of importation, such as the Duke of Devonshire. But the trade came to see presently that there was money in this new fashion, and imported so vigorously that the Society found its exertions needless. Messrs. Rollisson of Tooting, Messrs. Veitch of Chelsea, and Messrs. Lowe of Clapton distinguished themselves from the outset. Of these three firms, one is extinct, the second has taken up and made its own the fascinating study of hybridization among orchids, the third still perseveres. 20 years ago nearly all the great nurserymen in London used to send out their travellers, but they have mostly dropped the practice. Correspondents forward a shipment from time to time. The expenses of the collector are heavy, even if he draw no more than his due, and the temptation to make up a fancy bill cannot be resisted by some weak mortals. Then grave losses are always probable. In the case of South American importations, certain. It has happened not once, but 100 times, that the toil of months, the dangers, the sufferings, and the hard money expended go to absolute waste. 20 or 30,000 plants or more an honest man collects, brings them down from the mountains or the forests, packs carefully, and ships. The freight alone may reach from £300 to £800. I have personally known instances when it exceeded 500. The cases arrive in England, and not a living thing therein. A steamship company may reduce its charge under such circumstances, but again and again it will happen that the speculator stands out of £1,000 clean when his boxes are opened. He may hope to recover it on the next cargo, but that is still a question of luck. No wonder that men whose business is not confined to orchids withdrew from the risks of importation, returning to roses and lilies and daffodowndillies with a new enthusiasm. There is another point also which has varying force with different characters. The loss of life among those men who go out collecting has been greater proportionately than in any class of which I have heard. In former times, at least, they were chosen haphazard among intelligent and trustworthy employees of the firm. Trustworthiness was a grand point, for reasons hinted. The honest youth, not very strong perhaps in an English climate, went bravely forth into the unhealthiest parts of unhealthy lands, where food is very scarce and very, very rough, where he was wet through day after day for weeks at a time, where the fever of varied sort comes as regularly as Sunday, where from month to month he found no one with whom to exchange a word. I could make out a startling list of the martyrs of orchidology. Among Mr. Sanders' collectors alone, Falkenberg perished at Panama, Klaboch in Mexico, Andres at Rio Hacha, Wallace in Ecuador, Schroeder in Sierra Leone, Arnold on the Orinoco, Digance in Brazil, Brown in Madagascar. Sir Trevor Lawrence mentions a case where the zealous explorer waded for a fortnight up to his middle in mud, searching for a plant he had heard of. I have not identified this instance of devotion, but we know of rarities which would demand perseverance and sufferings almost equal to secure them. If employers could find the heart to tempt a fellow creature into such risks, the chances are that it would prove bad business. For to discover a new or valuable orchid is only the first step in a commercial enterprise. It remains to secure the article, to bring it safely into a realm that may be called civilized, to pack it and superintend its transport through the sweltering lowland to a shipping place. If the collector sicken after finding his prize, these cares are neglected more or less. If he die, all comes to a full stop. Thus it happens that the importing business has been given up by one firm after another. Odontoglossums, as I said, belong to America, to the mountainous parts of the continent in general. Though it would be wildly rash to pronounce which is the loveliest of orchids, no man with eyes would dispute that O. crispum Alexandræ is the queen of this genus. She has her home in the States of Columbia, and those who seek her make Bogota their headquarters. If the collector wants the broad-petalled variety, he goes about 10 days to the southward before commencing operations. If the narrow-petalled, about 2 days to the north, on mule-back, of course. His first care on arrival in the neighbourhood, which is unexplored ground, if such he can discover, is to hire a wood, that is, a tract of mountain clothed more or less with timber. I have tried to procure one of these leases, which must be odd documents, but orchid farming is a close and secret business. The arrangement concluded in legal form, he hires natives, 20 or 50 or 100, as circumstances advise, and sends them to cut down trees, building meantime a wooden stage of sufficient length to bear the plunder expected. This is used for cleaning and drying the plants brought in. Afterwards, if he be prudent, he follows his lumbermen to see that their indolence does not shirk the big trunks, which give extra trouble naturally, though they yield the best and largest return. It is a terribly wasteful process. If we estimate that a good tree has been felled for every 3 scraps of Odontoglossum which are now established in Europe, that will be no exaggeration, and for many years past they have been arriving by hundreds of thousands annually. But there is no alternative. An European cannot explore that green wilderness overhead. If he could, his accumulations would be so slow and costly as to raise the proceeds to an impossible figure. The natives will not climb, and they would tear the plants to bits. Timber has no value in these parts as yet, but the day approaches when government must interfere. The average yield of Odontoglossum crispum per tree is certainly not more than 5 large and small together. Once upon a time Mr. Kerbach recovered 53 at one felling, and the incident has grown into a legend. 2 or 3 is the usual number. Upon the other hand, 50 or 60 of O. gloriosum, comparatively worthless, are often secured. The cutters receive a fixed price of 6d. for each orchid, without reference to species or quality. When his concession is exhausted, the traveller overhauls the produce carefully, throwing away those damaged pieces which would ferment in the long hot journey home and spoil the others. When all are clean and dry, he fixes them with copper wire on sticks, which are nailed across boxes for transport. Long experience has laid down rules for each detail of this process. The sticks, for example, are 1 inch in diameter, fitting into boxes 2 feet 3 inches wide, 2 feet deep, neither more nor less. Then the long file of mules sets out for Bogota, perhaps 10 days' march, each animal carrying 2 boxes, a burden ridiculously light, but on such tracks it is dimension which has to be considered. On arrival at Bogota, the cases are unpacked and examined for the last time, restowed and consigned to the muleteers again. In 6 days they reach Honda, on the Magdalena River, where until lately they were embarked on rafts for a journey of 14 days to Savanilla. At the present time an American company has established a service of flat-bottomed steamers, which cover the distance in 7 days, thus reducing the risks of the journey by 1/2. But they are still terrible. Not a breath of wind stirs the air at that season, for the collector cannot choose his time. The boxes are piled on deck. Even the pitiless sunshine is not so deadly as the stewing heat below. He has a score of blankets to cover them, on which he lays a thatch of palm leaves, and all day long he souses the pile with water. But too well the poor fellow knows that mischief is busy down below. Another anxiety possesses him too. It may very well be that on arrival at Savanilla he has to wait days in that sweltering atmosphere for the Royal Mail steamer, and when it comes in his troubles do not cease, for the stowage of the precious cargo is vastly important. On deck it will almost certainly be injured by salt water. In the hold it will ferment. Amidships it is apt to be baked by the engine fire. Whilst writing, I learn that Mr. Sander has lost 267 cases by this latter mishap, as is supposed. So utterly hopeless is their condition that he will not go to the expense of overhauling them. They lie at Southampton, and to anybody who will take them away all parties concerned will be grateful. The expense of making this shipment a reader may judge from the hints given. The Royal Mail Company's charge for freight from Manzanilla is £750. I could give an incident of the same class, yet more startling, with reference to Phalaenopsis. It is proper to add that the most enterprising of assurance companies do not yet see their way to accept any kind of risks in the orchid trade. Importers must bear all the burden. To me it seems surprising that the plants can be sold so cheap, all things considered. Many persons think and hope that prices will fall, and that may probably happen with regard to some genera, but the shrewdest of those very shrewd men who conduct the business all look for a rise. Odontoglossum harryanum always reminds me, in such an odd association of ideas as everyone has experienced, of a thunderstorm. The contrast of its intense brown blotches with the azure throat and the broad snowy lip affect me somehow with admiring oppression. Very absurd, but on est fait comme ça, as Nana excused herself. To call this most striking flower harryanum is grotesque. The public is not interested in those circumstances which give the name significance for a few, and if there be any flower which demands an expressive title, it is this, in my judgment. Possibly it was some Indian report which had slipped his recollection that led Roezl to predict the discovery of a new Odontoglot unlike any other, in the very district where Odontoglossum harryanum was found after his death, though the story is quoted as an example of that instinct which guides the heaven-born collector. The first plants came unannounced in a small box sent by Senor Pantoja of Colombia to Messrs. Horseman in 1885, and they were flowered next year by Messrs. Veitch. The dullest who sees it can now imagine the excitement when this marvel was displayed, coming from an unknown habitat. Roezl's prediction occurred to many of his acquaintance, I have heard, but Mr. Sander had a living faith in his old friend's sagacity. Forthwith he dispatched a collector to the spot which Roezl had named, but not visited, and found the treasure. The legends of orchidology will be gathered one day, perhaps, and if the editor be competent, his volume should be almost as interesting to the public as to the cognoscenti. I have been speaking hitherto of Colombian Odontoglossums, which are reckoned among the hardiest of their class. Along with them, in the same temperature, grow the cool Masdevallias, which probably are the most difficult of all to transport. There was once a grand consignment of Masdevallia Schlimii, which Mr. Roezl dispatched on his own account. It contained 27,000 plants of this species, representing at that time a fortune. Mr. Roezl was the luckiest and most experienced of collectors, and he took special pains with this unique shipment. Among 27,000, 2 bits survived when the cases were opened. The agent hurried them off to Stevens's auction rooms, and sold them forthwith at 40 guineas each. But I must stick to Odontoglossums. Speculative as is the business of importing the northern species, to gather those of Peru and Ecuador is almost desperate. The roads of Colombia are good, the population civilized, conveniences abound. If we compare that region with the orchid-bearing territories of the south, there is a fortune to be secured by anyone who will bring to market a lot of Odontoglossum niveum in fair condition. Its habitat is perfectly well known. I am not aware that it has a delicate constitution, but no collector is so rash or so enthusiastic as to try that adventure again now that its perils are understood, and no employer is so reckless as to urge him. The true variety of O. Hallii stands in much the same case. To obtain it, the explorer must march in the bed of a torrent, and on the face of a precipice alternately, for an uncertain period of time, with a river to cross about every day, and he has to bring back his loaded mules or Indians over the same pathless waste. The Roraima mountain begins to be regarded as quite easy travel for the orchid hunter nowadays. If I mention that the canoe work on this route demands 32 portages, 32 loadings and unloadings of the cargo, the reader can judge what a difficult road must be. Ascending the Roraima, Mr. Dressel, collecting for Mr. Sander, lost his herbarium in the Essequibo River. Savants alone are able to estimate the awful nature of the crisis when a comrade loses his grip of that treasure. For them it is needless to add that everything else went to the bottom. One is tempted to linger among the odontoglots, though time is pressing. In no class of orchids are natural hybrids so mysterious and frequent. Sometimes one can detect the parentage. In such cases, doubtless, the crossing occurred but a few generations back. As a rule, however, such plants are the result of breeding in and in from age to age, causing all manner of delightful complications. How many can trace the lineage of Mr. Bull's Odontoglossum delectabile, ivory white, fringed with rose, strikingly blotched with red and showing a golden labellum, or Mr. Sander's Odontoglossum Alberti Edwardi, which has a broad soft margin of gold about its stately petals. Another is rosy white, closely splashed with pale purple, and dotted round the edge with spots of the same tint so thickly placed that they resemble a fringe. Such marvels turn up in an importation without the slightest warning. No peculiarity betrays them until the flowers open, when the lucky purchaser discovers that a plant for which he gave perhaps a shilling is worth an indefinite number of guineas. Lycaste also is a genus peculiar to America, such a favourite among those who know its merits, that the species Lycaste skinneri is called the drawing-room flower. Professor Reichenbach observes in his superb volume that many people utterly ignorant of orchids grow this plant in their miscellaneous collection. I speak of it without prejudice, for to my mind the bloom is stiff, heavy, and poor in colour, but there are tremendous exceptions. In the first place, Lycaste skinneri alba, the pure white variety, beggars all description. Its great flower seems to be sculptured in the snowiest of transparent marble. That stolid, pretentious air which offends one, offends me at least, in the coloured examples, becomes virginal dignity in this case. Then, of the normal type, there are more than 100 variations recognized, some with lips as deep in tone and as smooth in texture as velvet, of all shades from maroon to brightest crimson. It will be understood that I allude to the common forms in depreciating this species. How vast is the difference between them their commercial value shows. Plants of the same size and the same species range from 3s. 6d to 35 guineas or more indefinitely. Lycastes are found in the woods, of Guatemala especially, and I have heard no such adventures in the gathering of them as attend Odontoglossums. Easily obtained, easily transported, and remarkably easy to grow, of course they are cheap. A man must really give his mind to it to kill a Lycaste. This counts for much, no doubt, in the popularity of the genus, but it has plenty of other virtues. Lycaste skinneri opens in the depth of winter, and all the rest, I think, in the dull months. Then they are profuse of bloom, throwing up half a dozen spikes, or in some species a dozen, from a single bulb, and the flowers last a prodigious time. Their extraordinary thickness in every part enables them to withstand bad air and changes of temperature, so that ladies keep them on a drawing-room table night and day for months, without change perceptible. Mr. Williams names an instance where a Lycaste skinneri, bought in full bloom on February the 2nd, was kept in a sitting-room till May the 18th, when the purchaser took it back, still handsome. I have heard cases more surprising. Of species somewhat less common, there is Lycaste aromatica, a little gem which throws up an indefinite number of short spikes, each crowned with a greenish-yellow triangular sort of cup, deliciously scented. I am acquainted with no flower that excites such enthusiasm among ladies who fancy Messieurs Liberty's style of toilette. Sad experience tells me that 10 commandments, or 20, will not restrain them from appropriating it. Lycaste cruenta is almost as tempting. As for Lycaste leucanthe, an exquisite combination of pale green and snow white, it ranks with Lycaste skinneri alba as a thing too beautiful for words. This species has not been long introduced, and at the moment it is dear proportionately. There is yet another virtue of the Lycaste which appeals to the expert. It lends itself readily to hybridization. This most fascinating pursuit attracts few amateurs as yet, and the professionals have little time or inclination for experiments. They naturally prefer to make such crosses as are almost certain to pay. Thus it comes about that the hybridization of Lycastes has been attempted but recently, and none of the seedlings, so far as I can learn, have flowered. They have been obtained, however, in abundance, not only from direct crossing, but also from alliance with Zygopetalum, Anguloa, and Maxillaria. End of section 5. Of About Orchids, a Chat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Yearsley. About Orchids, a Chat, by Frederick Boyle. Chapter 4. Cool Orchids. Section 2. The genus Cypripedium, lady's slipper, is perhaps more widely scattered over the globe than any other class of plant. I, at least, am acquainted with none that approaches it. From China to Peru, nay, beyond, from Archangel to Torres Straits. But it is wise to avoid these semi-poetic descriptions. In brief, if we except Africa and the temperate parts of Australia, there is no large tract of country in the world that does not produce Cypripediums, and few authorities doubt that a larger acquaintance with those realms will bring them under the rule. We have a species in England, Cypripedium calceolus, by no means insignificant. It can be purchased from the dealers, but it is almost extinct in this country now. America furnishes a variety of species, which ought to be hardy. They will bear a frost below 0, but our winter damp is intolerable. Mr. Godseff tells me that he has seen Cypripedium spectabile growing like any waterweed in the bogs of New Jersey, where it is frozen hard, roots and all, for several months of the year. But very few survive the season in this country, even if protected. Those fine specimens, so common at our spring shows, are imported in the dry state. From the United States also we get the charming C. candidum, C. parviflorum, C. pubescens, and many more less important. Canada and Siberia furnish C. guttatum, C. macranthum, and others. I saw in Russia, and brought home, a magnificent species, tall and stately, bearing a great golden flower, which is not known in the trade, but they all rotted gradually. Therefore I do not recommend these fine outdoor varieties, which the inexperienced are apt to think so easy. At the same cost, others may be bought which, coming from the highlands of hot countries, are used to a moderate damp in winter. Foremost of these, perhaps the oldest of cool orchids in cultivation, is Cypripedium insigne, from Nepal. Everyone knows its original type, which has grown so common that I remarked a healthy pot at a window garden exhibition some years ago in Westminster. One may say that this, the early and familiar form, has no value at present, so many fine varieties have been introduced. A reader may form a notion of the difference when I state that a small plant of exceptional merit sold for 30 guineas a short time ago. It was Cypripedium insigne, but glorified. This ranks among the fascination of orchid culture. You may buy a lot of some common kind, imported, at a price representing coppers for each individual, and among them may appear, when they come to bloom, an eccentricity which sells for £100 or more. The experienced collector has a volume of such legends. There is another side to the question, truly, but it does not personally interest the class which I address. To make a choice among numberless stories of this sort, we may take the instance of Cypripedium spicerianum. It turned up among a quantity of Cypripedium insigne in the greenhouse of Mrs. Spicer, a lady residing at Twickenham. Astonished at the appearance of this swan among her ducks, she asked Mr. Veitch to look at it. He was delighted to pay 70 guineas down for such a prize. Cypripediums propagate easily, no more examples came into the market, and for some years this lovely species was a treasure for dukes and millionaires. It was no secret that the precious novelty came from Mrs. Spicer's greenhouse, but to call on a strange lady and demand how she became possessed of a certain plant is not a course of action that commends itself to respectable businessmen. The circumstances gave no clue. Messrs. Spicer were and are large manufacturers of paper. There is no visible connection betwixt paper and Indian orchids. By discreet inquiries, however, it was ascertained that one of the lady's sons had a tea plantation in Assam. No more was needed. By the next mail Mr. Forstermann started for that vague destination, and in process of time reached Mr. Spicer's bungalow. There he asked for a job. None could be found for him, but tea planters are hospitable, and the stranger was invited to stop for a day or two. But he could not lead the conversation towards orchids, perhaps because his efforts were too clever, perhaps because his host took no interest in the subject. One day, however, Mr. Spicer's manager invited him to go shooting, and casually remarked, "We shall pass the spot where I found those orchids they're making such a fuss about at home." Be sure Mr. Forstermann was alert that morning. Thus put upon the track, he discovered quantities of it, bade the tea planter adieu, and went to work. But in the very moment of triumph a tiger barred the way. His coolies bolted, and nothing would persuade them to go further. Mr. Forstermann was no shikari, but he felt himself called upon to uphold the cause of science and the honour of England at this juncture. In great agitation he went for that feline, and, in short, its skin still adorns Mrs. Sander's drawing-room. Thus it happened that on a certain Thursday a small pot of C. Spicerianum was sold as usual for 60 guineas at Stevens's. On the Thursday following, all the world could buy fine plants at a guinea. Cypripedium is the favourite orchid of the day. It has every advantage, except, to my perverse mind, brilliancy of colour. None show a whole tone. Even the lovely C. niveum is not pure white. My views, however, find no backing. At all other points the genus deserves to be a favourite. In the first place, it is the most interesting of all orchids to science. Then its endless variations of form, its astonishing oddities, its wide range of hues, its easy culture, its readiness to hybridize and to ripen seed, the certainty, by comparison, of rearing the proceeds. Each of these merits appeals to one or other of orchid growers. Many of the species which come from torrid lands, indeed, are troublesome, but with such we are not concerned. The cool varieties will do well anywhere, provided they receive water enough in summer, and not too little in winter. I do not speak of the American and Siberian classes, which are nearly hopeless for the amateur, nor of the Hong Kong Cypripedium purpuratum, a very puzzling example. On the roll of martyrs to orchidology, Mr. Pearce stands high. To him we owe, among many fine things, the hybrid begonias, which are becoming such favourites for bedding and other purposes. He discovered the 3 original types, parents of the innumerable garden flowers now on sale, Begonia Pearcii, B. Veitchii, and B. boliviensis. It was his great luck and great honour to find Masdevallia Veitchii, so long, so often, so laboriously searched for from that day to this, but never even heard of. To collect another shipment of that glorious orchid, Mr. Pearce sailed for Peru, in the service, I think, of Mr. Bull. Unhappily, for us all, as well as for himself, he was detained at Panama. Somewhere in those parts there is a magnificent Cypripedium with which we are acquainted only by the dried inflorescence, named planifolium. The poor fellow could not resist this temptation. They told him at Panama that no white man had returned from the spot, but he went on. The Indians brought him back some days or weeks later without the prize, and he died on arrival. Oncidiums also are a product of the New World exclusively. In fact, of the 4 classes most useful to amateurs, 3 belong wholly to America, and the 4th in great part. I resist the temptation to include Masdevallia, because that genus is not so perfectly easy as the rest. But if it be added, 9/10 assuredly of the plants in our cool house come from the West. Among the special merits of the Oncidium is its colour. I have heard thoughtless persons complain that they are all yellow, which, as a statement of fact, is near enough to the truth, for about 3/4 may be so described roughly. But this dispensation is another proof of nature's kindly regard for the interests of our science. A clear, strong, golden yellow is the colour that would have been wanting in our cool houses had not the Oncidium supplied it. Shades of lemon and buff are frequent among Odontoglossums, but, in a rough, general way of speaking, they have a white ground. Masdevallias give us scarlet and orange and purple, Lycastes green and dull yellow, Sophronitis crimson, Mesospinidium rose, and so forth. Blue must not be looked for. Even counting the new Utricularia for an orchid, as most people do, there are, I think, but 5 species that will live among us at present in all the prodigious family, showing this colour, and every one of them is very hot. Thus it appears that the Oncidium fills a gap, and how gloriously! There is no such pure gold in the scheme of the universe as it displays under 50 shapes wondrously varied. Thus Oncidium macranthum. One is continually tempted to exclaim, as one or other glory of the orchid world recurs to mind, that it is the supreme triumph of floral beauty. I have sinned thus, and I know it. Therefore let the reader seek an opportunity to behold O. macranthum, and judge for himself. But it seems to me that nature gives us a hint. As though proudly conscious what a marvel it will unfold, this superb flower often demands 9 months to perfect itself. Dr. Wallace told me of an instance in his collection where 18 months elapsed from the appearance of the spike until the opening of the first bloom. But it lasts a time proportionate. Nature forestalled the dreams of aesthetic colourists when she designed Oncidium macranthum. Thus, and not otherwise, would the thoughtful of them arrange a harmony in gold and bronze. But nature, with characteristic indifference to the fancies of mankind, hid her chef d'oeuvre in the wilds of Ecuador. Hardly less striking, however, though perhaps less beautiful, are its sisters of the small-lipped species, Oncidium serratum, O. superbiens, and O. sculptum. This last is rarely seen. As with others of its class, the spike grows very long, 12 feet perhaps, if it were allowed to stretch. The flowers are small comparatively, clear, bronze-brown, highly polished, so closely and daintily frilled round the edges that a fairy goffering iron could not give more regular effects, and outlined by a narrow band of gold. Oncidium serratum has a much larger bloom, but less compact, rather fly-away indeed, its sepals widening gracefully from a narrow neck. Excessively curious is the disposition of the petals, which close their tips to form a circle of brown and gold around the column. The purpose of this extraordinary arrangement, unique among orchids, I believe, will be discovered one day, for purpose there is, no doubt. To judge by analogy, it may be supposed that the insect upon which Oncidium serratum depends for fertilization likes to stand upon this ring while thrusting its proboscis into the nectary. The fourth of these fine species, Oncidium superbiens, ranks among the grandest of flowers. Knowing its own value, it rarely consents to oblige. The dusty green sepals are margined with yellow, petals white, clouded with pale purple, lip very small, of course purple, surmounted by a great golden crest. Most strange and curious is Oncidium fuscatum, of which the shape defies description. Seen from the back, it shows a floriated cross of equal limbs, but in front the nethermost is hidden by a spreading lip, very large proportionately. The prevailing tint is a dun purple, but each arm has a broad white tip. Dun purple also is the centre of the labellum, edged with a distinct band of lighter hue, which again, towards the margin, becomes white. These changes of tone are not gradual, but as clear as a brush could make them. Botanists must long to dissect this extraordinary flower, but the opportunity seldom occurs. It is desperately puzzling to understand how nature has packed away the component parts of its inflorescence, so as to resolve them into 4 narrow arms and a labellum. But the colouring of this plant is not always dull. In the small botanic garden at Florence, by Santa Maria Maggiore, I remarked with astonishment an Oncidium fuscatum, of which the lip was scarlet crimson, and the other tints bright to match. That collection is admirably grown, but orchids are still scarce in Italy. The Society did not know what a prize it had secured by chance. The genus Oncidium has perhaps more examples of a startling combination in hues than any other, but one must speak thoughtfully and cautiously upon such points. I have not to deal with culture, but one hint may be given. Gardeners who have a miscellaneous collection to look after often set themselves against an experiment in orchid growing, because these plants suffer terribly from greenfly and other pests, and will not bear smoking. To keep them clean and healthy by washing demands labour for which they have no time. This is a very reasonable objection, but though the smoke of tobacco is actually ruination, no plant whatever suffers from the steam thereof. An ingenious Frenchman has invented and patented in England lately a machine called the Thanatophore, which I confidently recommend. It can be obtained from Messrs. B.S. Williams of Upper Holloway. The Thanatophore destroys every insect within reach of its vapour, excepting, curiously enough, scalybug, which, however, does not persecute cool orchids much. The machine may be obtained in different sizes through any good ironmonger. To sum up, these plants ask nothing in return for the measureless enjoyments they give, but light, shade from the summer sun, protection from the winter frost, moisture, and brains. I am allowed to print a letter which bears upon several points to which I have alluded. It is not cheerful reading for the enthusiast. He will be apt to cry, "Would that the difficulties and perils were infinitely graver, so grave that the collecting grounds might have a rest for 20 years." January the 19th, 1893. Dear Sir, I have received your 2 letters asking for Cattleya Lawrenceana, Pancratium guianense, and Catasetum pileatum. Kindly excuse my answering your letters only to-day, but I have been away in the interior, and on my return was sick, beside other business taking up my time. I was unable to write until to-day. Now let me give you some information concerning orchid collecting in this colony. 6 or 7 years ago, just when the gold industry was starting, very few people ever ventured into the far interior. Boats, river hands, and Indians could be hired at ridiculously low prices, and travelling and bartering paid. Wages for Indians being about a shilling per day, and all found. The same for river hands. Captains and boatswains to pilot the boat through the rapids, up and down, for 64 cents a day. Today you have got to pay 64 to 80 cents per day for Indians and river hands. Captains and boatswains, $2 the former and $1.50 the latter per day, and then you often cannot get them. Boat hire used to be $8 to $10 for a big boat for 3 to 4 months. Today, $5, $6, and $7 per day, and all through the rapid development of the gold industry. As you can calculate 25 days' river travel to get within reach of the Savannah lands, you can reckon what the expenses must be, and then again about 5 to 7 days coming down the river, and a couple of days to lay over. Then you must count 2 trips like this, one to bring you up and one to bring you down 3 months after, when you return with your collection. Besides this, you run the risk of losing your boat in the rapids either way, which happens not very unfrequently either going or coming, and we have not only to record the loss of several boats with goods, etc., every month, but generally to record the loss of life. Only 2 cases happening last month, in one case 7, in the other 12 men losing their lives. Besides, river hands and blacks will not go up further than the boats can travel, and nothing will induce them to go among the Indians, being afraid of getting poisoned by Indians, kaiserimas, or strangled. So you have to rely utterly on Indians, which you often cannot get, as the district of Roraima is very poorly inhabited, and most of the Indians died by smallpox and measles breaking out among them 4 years ago, and those that survived left the district,
and you will find whole districts nearly uninhabited. About 5 years ago I went up with Mr. Osmers to Roraima, but he broke down before we reached the savannah. He lay there for a week, and I gave him up. He recovered, however, and dragged himself into the savannah near Roraima, about 3 days distant from it, where I left him. Here we found and made a splendid collection of about 3,000 first-class plants of different kinds. While I was going up to Roraima, he stayed in the savannah, still too sick to go further. At Roraima I collected everything except Cattleya lawrenceana, which was utterly rooted out already by former collectors. On my return to Osmer's camp I found him more dead than alive, thrown down by a new attack of sickness. But not alone that, I also found him abandoned by most of our Indians, who had fled on account of the Canaima having killed 3 of their number. So Mr. Osmers, who got soon better, and I made up our baskets with plants, and made everything ready. Our Indians returning partly, I sent him ahead with as many loads as we could carry, I staying behind with the rest of baskets of plants. Had all our Indians come back, we would have been all right, but this not being the case, I had to stay until the Indians returned and fetched me off. After this we got back all right. This was before the sickness broke out among the Indians. Last year I went up with Mr. Cromer, who met me going up river while I was coming down, so I joined him. We got up all right to the river's head, but here our troubles began, as we got only about 8 Indians to go on with us, who had worked in the gold diggings, and no others could be had, the district being abandoned. We had to pay them $half a day to carry loads, so we pushed on, carrying part of our loads, leaving the rest of our cargo behind, until we reached the savannah, when we had to send them back several times to get the balance of our goods. From the time we reached the savannah we were starving, more or less, as we could procure only very little provisions. We hunted all about for Cattleya lawrenceana, and got only about 1,500 or so, it growing only here and there. At Roraima we did not hunt at all, as the district is utterly rubbed out by the Indians. We were about 14 days at Roraima, and got plenty of Utricularia campbelliana, U. Humboldtii, and U. montana, also Zygopetalum, Cypripedium lindleyanum, Oncidium nigratum, only 50, very rare now, Cypripedium schomburgianum, Zygopetalum burkii, and in fact all that is to be found on and about Roraima, except the Cattleya lawrenceana. Also plenty others, as Sobralia, Liliastrum, etc. So our collection was not a very great one. We had the hardest trouble now through the want of Indians to carry the loads. Beside this, the rainy weather set in, and our loads suffered badly for all the care we took of them. Besides, the Indians got disagreeable, having to go back several times to bring the remaining baskets. Nevertheless, we got down as far as the Curubing Mountains. Up to this time we were more or less always starving. Arrived at the Curubing Mountains, procured a scant supply of provisions, but lost nearly all of them in a small creek, and what was saved was spoiling under our eyes, it being then that the rainy season had fully started, drenching us from morning to night. It took us 9 days to get our loads over the mountain, where our boat was to reach us, to take us down river, and we were for 2½ days entirely without food. Besides the plants being damaged by stress of weather, the Indians had opened the baskets and thrown partly the loads away, not being able to carry the heavy soaked-through baskets over the mountains, so making us lose the best of our plants. Arrived at our landing, we had to wait for our boat, which arrived a week later in consequence of the river being high, and, of course, short of provisions. Still, we got away with what we had of our loads until we reached the first gold places, kept by a friend of mine, who supplied us with food. Thereafter we started for town. Halfway, at Kapuri Falls, one of the most dangerous, we swamped down over a rock, and so we lost some of our things. Still, saved all our plants, though they lay for a few hours under water with the boat. After this we reached town in safety. So, after coming home, we found, on packing up, that we had only about 900 plants, that is, Cattleya lawrenceana, of which about 1/3 good, 1/3 medium, and 1/3 poor quality. This trip took us about 3½ months, and cost over $2,500, besides I, having poisoned my leg on a rotten stump, which I run up in my foot, lay for 4 months suffering terrible pain. You will of course see from this that orchid hunting is no pleasure. as you of course know, but what I want to point out to you is that Cattleya lawrenceana is very rare in the interior now. The river expenses fearfully high, in fact unreasonably high, on account of the gold digging. Labourers getting 64 cents to $1 per day, and all found. No Indians to be got, and those that you can get at ridiculous prices, and getting them too by working on places where they build and thatch houses and clear the ground from underbush, and as huntsmen for gold diggers. Even if Mr. Cromer had succeeded to get 3,000 or 4,000 fine Cattleya lawrenceana, it would have been of no value to us, as we could not have got anybody to carry them to the river, where a boat could reach. Besides this, I must also tell you that there is a licence to be paid out here if you want to collect orchids, amounting to $100, which Mr. Cromer had to pay, and also an export tax duty of 2 cents per piece. So that orchid collecting is made a very expensive affair, besides its success being very doubtful, even if a man is very well acquainted with Indian life and has visited the Savannah reaches year after year. We spent something over $2,500 to $2,900, including Mr. Cromer's and Steigfer's passage out on our last expedition. If you want to get any lawrenceana, you will have to send yourself, and as I said before, the results will be very doubtful. As far as I myself am concerned, I am interested, besides my baking business, in the gold diggings, and shall go up to the Savannah in a few months. I can give you first-class references if you should be willing to send an expedition, and we could come to some arrangement. At least, you would save the expenses of the passage of one of your collectors. I may say that I am quite conversant with the way of packing orchids, and handling them as well for travel as shipment. Kindly excuse, therefore, my lengthy letter and its bad writing, and if you should be inclined to go in for an expedition, just send me a list of what you require, and I will tell you whether the plants are found along the route of travel and in the Savannah visited. As, for instance, Cattleya superba does not grow at all in the district where Cattleya lawrenceana is to be found, but far further south. Before closing, I beg you to let me know the prices of about 25 of the best of and prettiest South American orchids, which I want for my own collection, as Cattleya Medellii, Cattleya triani, Odontoglossum crispum, Miltonia vexillaria, Cattleya labiata, and so on. I shall wait your answer as soon as possible, and send you a list by last mail of what is to be got in this colony. We also found on our last list something new, a very large bulbed Oncidium, or maybe Catasetum, on the top of Roraima, where we spent a night, but got only 2 specimens, one of which got lost, and the other one I left in the hands of Mr. Rodway, but so we tried our best. It decayed, having been too seriously damaged to revive and flower, and so enable us to see what it was, it not being in flower when found. Awaiting your kind reply, yours truly, Seeler. P.S. If you should send out one of your collectors or require any information, I shall be glad to give it. One of the most experienced collectors, M. Oversluys, writes from the Rio de Yanayaca, January 1893. Here it is absolutely necessary that one goes himself into the woods ahead of the peons, who are quite cowards to enter the woods, and not altogether without reason, for the larger part of them get sick here. And it is very hard to enter, nearly impenetrable and full of insects which make fresh-coming people to get cracked and mad. I have from the waist down not a place to put in a shilling piece which is not a wound through the very small red spider and other insects. Also my people are the same. Of the 5 men I took out, 2 have got fever already, and 1 ran back. Tomorrow I expect other peons, but not a single one from Mengabamba. It is a trouble to get men who will come into the woods, and I cannot have more than 8 or 10 to work with, because when I should not be continually behind them or ahead, they do nothing. It is not a question of money to do good here, but merely luck, and the way one treats people. The peons will come out less for their salaries than for good and plenty of food, which is very difficult to find in these scarce times. The plants are here one by one, and we have got but 1 tree with 3 plants. They are on the highest and biggest trees, and these must be cut down with axes. Below are all shrubs full of climbers and lianas about a finger width. Every step must be cut to advance, and the ground cleared below the high trees in order to spy the branches. It is a very difficult job. Nature has well protected this Cattleya. Nobody can like this kind of work. The poor man ends abruptly. I will write when I can. The mosquitoes don't leave me a moment.
The end of section 6 of About Orchids, a Chat. About Orchids, a Chat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Yearsley. About Orchids, a Chat by Frederick Boyle. Chapter 5, Section 1. Warm Orchids. By the expression warm, we understand that condition which is technically known as intermediate. It is waste of time to ask at this day why a Latin combination should be employed when there is an English monosyllable exactly equivalent. We, at least, will use our mother tongue. Warm orchids are those which like a minimum temperature while growing of 60 degrees, while resting of 55. As for the maximum, it signifies little in the former case, but in the latter, during the months of rest, it cannot be allowed to go beyond 60 degrees for any length of time without mischief. These conditions mean, in effect, that the house must be warmed during 9 months of the 12 in this realm of England. Hot orchids demand a fire the whole year round, saving a few very rare nights when the Briton swelters in tropical discomfort. Upon this dry subject of temperature, however, I would add one word of encouragement for those who are not willing to pay a heavy bill for coke. The cool house in general requires a fire at night until June the 1st. Under that condition, if it face the south in a warm locality, very many genera and species classed as intermediate should be so thoroughly started before artificial heat is withdrawn that they will do excellently, unless the season be unusual. Warm orchids come from a subtropic region, or from the mountains of a hotter climate, where their kinsfolk dwelling in the plains defy the thermometer. Just as in subtropic lands warm species occupy the lowlands, while the heights furnish odontoglossums and such lovers of a chilly atmosphere. There are, however, some warm odontoglossums, notable among them O. vexillarium, which botanists class with the Miltonias. This species is very fashionable, and I give it the place of honour, but not in my own view for its personal merits. The name is so singularly appropriate that one would like to hear the inventor's reasons for transfiguring it. Vexillum we know, and vexillarius, but vexillarium goes beyond my Latin. However, it is an intelligible word, and those acquainted with the appearance of regimental colours in old Rome perceive its fitness at a glance. The flat bloom seems to hang suspended from its centre, just as the vexillum figures in bas-relief on the arch of Antoninus, for example. To my mind, the colouring is insipid as a rule, and the general effect stark. Fashion, in orchids as in other things, has little reference to taste. I repeat with emphasis, as a rule, for some priceless specimens are no less than astounding in their blaze of colour, the quintessence of a million uninteresting blooms. The poorest of these plants have merit, no doubt, for those who can accommodate giants. They grow fast and big. There are specimens in this country a yard across, which display 150 or 200 flowers open at the same time for months. A superb show they make, rising over the pale sea-green foliage, 4 spikes perhaps from a single bulb. But this is a beauty of general effect, which must not be analysed, as I think. Odontoglossum vexillarium is brought from Colombia. There are 2 forms. The one, small, evenly red, flowering in autumn, was discovered by Frank Klaboch, nephew to the famous Roesel, on the Dagua River in Antioquia. For 8 years he persisted in dispatching small quantities to Europe, though every plant died. At length a safer method of transmission was found, but simultaneously poor Klaboch himself succumbed. It is an awful country, perhaps the wettest under the sun, though a favourite hunting ground of collectors now, for Cattleyas of value come from hence. Beside this precious odontoglot, there are still no means of transport, saving Indians and canoes. Odontoglossum vexillarium would not be thought costly if buyers knew how rare it is, how expensive to get, and how terribly difficult to bring home. 40,000 pieces were dispatched to Mr. Sander in one consignment. He hugged himself with delight when 3,000 proved to have some trace of vitality. Mr. Watson, assistant curator at Kew, recalls an amusing instance of the value and the mystery attached to this species so late as 1867. In that year Professor Reichenbach described it for the first time. He tells how a friend lent him the bloom upon a negative promise under 5 heads. First, not to show it to anyone else. 2, not to speak much about it. 3, not to take a drawing of it. 4, not to have a photograph made. 5, not to look oftener than 3 times at it. By the by, Mr. Watson gives the credit of the first discovery to the late Mr. Bowman, but I venture to believe that my account is exact, in reference to the Antioquia variety at least. The other form occurs in the famous district of Frontino, about 250 miles due north of the first habitat, and shows, savants would add of course, a striking difference. In the geographical distributions of species will be found the key to whole volumes of mystery that perplex us now. I once saw 3 Odontoglossums ranged side by side, which even an expert would pronounce mere varieties of the same plant if he were not familiar with them. Odontoglossum williamsi, Odontoglossum grande, and Odontoglossum schlieperianum. The middle one everybody knows, by sight at least, a big, stark, spread eagle flower, gamboge yellow, mottled with red-brown, vastly effective in the mass, but individually vulgar. On one side was Odontoglossum williamsi, essentially the same in flower and bulb and growth, but smaller. Opposite stood Odontoglossum schlieperianum, only to be distinguished as smaller still, but both these latter rank as species. They are separated from the common type, O. grande, by nearly 10 degrees of latitude and 10 degrees of longitude, nor, we might almost make an affidavit, do any intermediate forms exist in the space between, and those degrees are subtropical, by so much more significant than an equal distance in our zone. Instances of the same class, and more surprising, are found in many genera of orchid. The Frontino vexillarium grows cooler, has a much larger bloom, varies in hue from purest white to deepest red, and flowers in May or June. The most glorious of these things, however, is Odontoglossum vexillarium superbum, a plant of the greatest rarity, conspicuous for its blotch of deep purple in the centre of the lip, and its little dot of the same on each wing. Doubtless this is a natural hybrid betwixt the Antioquia form and Odontoglossum Yearsley, which is its neighbour. The chance of finding a bit of superbum in a bundle of the ordinary kind lends peculiar excitement to a sale of these plants. Such luck first occurred to Mr. Bath in Stevens's auction rooms. He paid £half-a-crown for a very weakly fragment, brought it round, flowered it, and received a prize for good gardening in the shape of £72, cheerfully paid by Sir Trevor Lawrence for a plant unique at that time. I am reminded of another little story. Among a great number of Cypripedium insigne received at St. Albans and established, Mr. Sander noted one presently of which the flower stalk was yellow instead of brown, as is usual. Sharp eyes are a valuable item of the orchid grower's stock in trade, for the smallest peculiarity among such sportive objects should not be neglected. Carefully he put the yellow stalk aside, the only one among thousands, one may say myriads, since Cypripedium insigne is one of our oldest and commonest orchids, and it never showed this phenomenon before. In due course the flower opened, and proved to be all golden. Mr. Sander cut his plant in 2, sold half for £75 to a favoured customer, and the other half publicly for 100 guineas. One of the purchasers has divided his plant now, and sold 2 bits at 100 guineas. Another piece was brought back by Mr. Sander, who wanted it for hybridizing, at 250 guineas. Not a bad profit for the buyer, who has still 2 plants left. Another instance occurs to me while I write. Such legends of shrewdness worthily rewarded fascinate a poor journalist who has the audacity to grow orchids. Mr. Harvey, solicitor, of Liverpool, strolling through the houses at St. Albans on July the 24th, 1883, remarked a plant of Loelia anceps, which had the ring mark on its pseudo-bulb much higher up than is usual. There might be some meaning in that eccentricity, he thought, paid the 2 guineas for the little thing, and on December the 1st, 1888, sold it back to Mr. Sander for £200. It proved to be Loelia anceps Amesiana, the grandest form of L. anceps yet discovered, rosy white, with petals deeply splashed, thus named after F. L. Ames, an American amateur. Such pleasing opportunities might arise for you or me any day. The first name that arises to most people in thinking of warm orchids is Cattleya. The genus Odontoglossum alone has more representatives under cultivation. 60 species of Cattleya are grown by amateurs who pay special attention to these plants. As for the number of varieties in a single species, one boasts 40, another 30, several pass the round dozen. They are exclusively American, but they flourish all over the enormous space between Mexico and the Argentine Republic. The genus is not a favourite of my own, for somewhat of the same reason which qualifies my regard for Odontoglossum vexillarium. Cattleyas are so obtrusively beautiful, they have such great flowers, which they thrust upon the eye with such assurance of admiration. Theirs is a style of effect, I refer to the majority, which may be called infantine, such as an intelligent and tasteful child might conceive if he had no fine sense of colour, and were too young to distinguish a showy from a charming form. But I say no more. The history of orchids, long established, is uncertain, but I believe that the very first Cattleya which appeared in Europe was Cattleya violacea loddigesi, imported by the great firm whose name it bears, to which we owe such a heavy debt. 2 years later came Cattleya labiata, of which more must be said, then Cattleya mossiae from Caracas, fourth Cattleya trianae, named after Colonel Tryan of Tolima in the United States of Colombia. Tryan well deserved immortality, for he was a native of that secluded land and a botanist. It is a natural supposition that his orchids must be the commonest of weeds in its home. Seeing how all Europe is stocked with it, and America also, rash people might say there are millions in cultivation. But it seems likely that C. trianae was never very frequent, and at the present time assuredly it is so scarce that collectors are not sent after it. Probably the Colonel, like many other savants, was an excellent man of business, and he established a corner when he saw the chance. C. mossiae stands in the same situation, or indeed worse. It can scarcely be found now. These instances convey a serious warning. In 70 years we have destroyed the native stock of 2 orchids, both so very free in propagating that they have an exceptional advantage in the struggle for existence. How long can rare species survive when the demand strengthens and widens year by year, while the means of communication and transport become easier all over the world? Other instances will be mentioned in their place. Island species are doomed, unless, like Loelia elegans, they have inaccessible crags on which to find refuge. It is only a question of time, but we may hope that governments will interfere before it is too late. Already Mr. Burbidge has suggested that someone who takes an interest in orchids should establish a farm, a plantation here and there about the world, where such plants grow naturally, and devote himself to careful hybridization on the spot. One might make as much, he writes, by breeding orchids as by breeding cattle, and of the two, in the long run, I should prefer the orchid farm. This scheme will be carried out one day, not so much for the purpose of hybridization as for plain market gardening, and the sooner the better. The prospect is still more dark for those who believe, as many do, that no epiphytal orchid under any circumstances can be induced to establish itself permanently in our greenhouses as it does at home. Doubtless, they say, it is possible to grow them and to flower them, by assiduous care, upon a scale which is seldom approached under the rough treatment of nature, but they are dying from year to year, in spite of appearances. That it is so in a few cases can hardly be denied, but seeing how many plants which have not changed hands since their establishment 20 or 30 or 40 years ago have grown continually bigger and finer, it seems much more probable that our ignorance is to blame for the loss of those species which suddenly collapse. Sir Trevor Lawrence observed the other day, "With regard to the longevity of orchids, I have one which I know to have been in this country for more than 50 years, probably even 20 years longer than that, Renanthera coccinea." The finest specimens of Cattleya in Mr. Stevenson Clarke's houses have been "grown on" from small pieces imported 20 years ago. If there were more collections which could boast, say, half a century of uninterrupted attention, we should have material for forming a judgment. As a rule, the dates of purchase or establishment were not carefully preserved till late years. But there is one species of Cattleya which must needs have 70 years of existence in Europe, since it had never been rediscovered till 1890. When we see a pot of C. labiata, the true autumn flowering variety, more than 2 years old, we know that the very plant itself must have been established about 1818, or at least its immediate parent, for no seedling has been raised, to public knowledge. In avowing a certain indifference to Cattleyas, I referred to the bulk, of course. The most gorgeous, the stateliest, the most imperial of all flowers on this earth is Cattleya dowiana, unless it be Cattleya aurea, a geographical variety of the same. They dwell 1,000 miles apart at least, the one in Colombia, the other in Costa Rica, and neither occurs, so far as is known, in the great intervening region. Not even a connecting link has been discovered, but the Atlantic coast of Central America is hardly explored, much less examined. In my time it was held, from Cape Comarin to Chagres, by independent tribes of savages, not independent in fact alone, but in name also. The Mosquito Indians are recognized by Europe as free. The Guatusos kept a space of many hundred miles from which no white man had returned. When I was in those parts, the Talamancas, though not so unfriendly, were only known by the report of adventurous pedlars. I made an attempt, comparatively spirited, to organize an exploring party for the benefit of the Guatusos, but no single volunteer answered our advertisements in San Jose de Costa Rica. I have lived to congratulate myself on that disappointment. Since my day a road has been cut through their wilds to Limon, certain luckless Britons having found the money for a railway. But an engineer who visited the coast but 2 years ago informs me that no one ever wandered into the bush. Collectors have not been there, assuredly, so there may be connecting links between Cattleya dowiana and C. aurea in that vast wilderness, but it is quite possible there are none. Words could not picture the glory of these marvels. In each, the scheme of colour is yellow and crimson, but there are important modifications. Yellow is the ground all through in Cattleya aurea, sepals, petals, and lip, unbroken in the two former, in the latter superbly streaked with crimson. But Cattleya dowiana shows crimson pencillings on its sepals, while the ground colour of the lip is crimson, broadly lined and reticulated with gold. Imagine 4 of these noble flowers on one stalk, each half a foot across. But it lies beyond the power of imagination. Cattleya dowiana was discovered by Warscewicz about 1850, and he sent home accounts too enthusiastic for belief. Steady-going Britons utterly refused to credit such a marvel. His few plants died, and there was an end of it for the time. I may mention an instance of more recent date, where the eyewitness of a collector was flatly rejected at home. Monsieur Saint Leger, residing at Asuncion, the capital of Paraguay, wrote a warm description of an orchid in those parts to scientific friends. The account reached England, and was treated with derision. Monsieur Saint Leger, nettled, sent some dried flowers for a testimony, but the mind of the orchidaceous public was made up. In 1883 he brought a quantity of plants, and put them up at auction. Nobody in particular would buy. So those reckless or simple or trusting persons who invested a few shillings in a bundle had all the fun to themselves a few months afterwards, when the beautiful Oncidium Jonesianum appeared. to confound the unbelieving. It must be added, however, that orchid growers may well become an incredulous generation. When their judgment leads them wrong, we hear of it, the tale is published, and outsiders mock. But these gentlemen receive startling reports continually, honest enough for the most part. Much experience and some loss have made them rather cynical when a new wonder is announced. The particular case of Monsieur St. Leger was complicated by the extreme resemblance which the foliage of Oncidium jonesianum bears to that of Oncidium ciboletum, a species almost worthless. Unfortunately, the beautiful thing declines to live with us, as yet. Cattleya dowiana was rediscovered by Mr. Arker when collecting birds. It must have been a grand moment for Warscewicz when the horticultural world was convulsed by its appearance in bloom. Cattleya aurea had no adventures of this sort. Mr. Wallace found it in 1868 in the province of Antioquia, and again on the west bank of the Magdalena, but it is very rare. This species is persecuted in its native home by a beetle which accompanies it to Europe, not infrequently, in the form of eggs, no doubt. A more troublesome alien is the fly, which haunts Cattleya Mandellii, and for a long time prejudiced growers against that fine species, until, in fact, they had made a practical and rather costly study of its habits. An experienced grower detects the presence of this enemy at a glance. It pierces an eye, a back one in general, happily, and deposits an egg in the very centre. Presently this growth begins to swell in a manner that delights the ingenuous horticulturist, until he remarks that its length does not keep pace with its breadth. But one remedy has yet been discovered, cutting off any suspected growth. We understand that Cattleya Mandellii is as safe to import as any other species, unless it be gathered at the wrong time. Footnote: I have learned by a doleful experience that this fly, commonly called the weevil, is quite at home on Loelia purpurata. In fact, it will prey on any Cattleya. End footnote. Among the most glorious, rarest, and most valuable of Cattleyas is Cattleya hardiana, doubtless a natural hybrid of Cattleya aurea with Cattleya gigas sanderiana. Few of us have yet seen it. 200 guinea plants are not common spectacles. It has an immense flower, rose purple, the lip purple magenta veined with gold. Cattleya sanderiana offers an interesting story. Mr. Mao, one of Mr. Sanders's collectors, was dispatched to Bogota in search of Odontoglossum crispum. While tramping through the woods he came across a very large Cattleya at rest, and gathered such pieces as fell in his way, attaching so little importance to them, however, that he did not name the matter in his reports. 4 cases Mr. Mao brought home with his stock of Odontoglossums, which were opened in due course of business. We can quite believe that it was one of the stirring moments of Mr. Sanders's life. The plants bore many dry specimens of last year's inflorescence, displaying such extraordinary size as proved the variety to be new, and there is no large Cattleya of indifferent colouring. To receive a plant of that character unannounced, undescribed, is an experience without parallel for half a century. Mr. Mao was sent back by next mail to secure every fragment he could find. Meantime those in hand were established, and Mr. Brymer, M.P., bought one. Mr. Brymer is immortalized by the dendrobe which bears his name. The new Cattleya proved kindly, and just before Mr. Mao returned with some thousands of its like, Mr. Brymer's purchase broke into bloom. That must have been another glorious moment for Mr. Sander, when the great bud unfolded, displaying sepals and petals of the rosiest, freshest, softest pink, 11 inches across, and a crimson labellum exquisitely shown up by a broad patch of white on either side of the throat. Mr. Brymer was good enough to lend his specimen for the purpose of advertisement, and Messrs. Stevens enthusiastically fixed a green baize partition across their rooms as a background for the wondrous novelty. What excitement reigned there on the great day is not to be described. I have heard that over £2,000 was taken in the room. Most of the Cattleyas with which the public is familiar, Mossiae, Trianae, Mendellii, and so forth, have white varieties, but an example absolutely pure is so uncommon that it fetches a long price. Loveliest of these is Cattleya skinneri alba. For generations, if not for ages, the people of Costa Rica have been gathering every morsel they can find and planting it upon the roofs of their mud-built churches. Yearsley and the early collectors had a good time buying these semi-sacred flowers from the priests, bribing the parishioners to steal them, or, when occasion served, playing the thief themselves. But the game is nearly up. Seldom now can a piece of Cattleya skinneri alba be obtained by honest means, and when a collector arrives, guards are set upon the churches that still keep their decoration. No plant has ever been found in the forest, we understand. End of Chapter 5, Section 1. Of About Orchids, a Chat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Yearsley. About Orchids, a Chat, by Frederick Boyle. Chapter 5, Section 2. Warm Orchids. It is just the same case with Loelia anceps alba. The genus Loelia is distinguished from Cattleya by a peculiarity to be remarked only in dissection. Its pollen masses are 8 as against 4. To my taste, however, the species are more charming on the whole. There is Loelia purpurata. Casual observers always find it hard to grasp the fact that orchids are weeds in their native homes, just like foxgloves and dandelions with us. In this instance, as I have noted, they flatly refuse to believe, and certainly, upon the face of it, their incredulity is reasonable. Loelia purpurata falls under the head of hot orchids. Loelia anceps, however, is not so exacting. Many people grow it in the cool house when they can expose it there to the full blaze of sunshine. In its commonest form it is divinely beautiful. I have seen a plant in Mr. Eastey's collection with 23 spikes, the flowers all open at once. Such a spectacle is not to be described in prose. But when the enthusiast has rashly said that earth contains no more ethereal loveliness, let him behold Loelia anceps alba, the white variety. The dullest man I ever knew, who had a commonplace for all occasions, found no word in presence of that marvel. Even the half-castes of Mexico, who have no soul apparently for things above horseflesh and cockfights and love-making, reverence this saintly bloom. The Indians adore it, like their brethren to the south, who have tenderly removed every plant of Cattleya skinneri alba for generations unknown to set upon their churches. They collect this supreme effort of nature and replant it round their huts. So thoroughly has the work been done in either case that no single specimen was ever seen in the forest. Every one has been bought from the Indians, and the supply is exhausted. That is to say, a good many more are known to exist, but very rarely now can the owner be persuaded to part with one. The first example reached England nearly half a century ago, sent probably by a native trader to his correspondent in this country, but, as was usual at that time, the circumstances are doubtful. It found its way somehow to Mr. Dawson of Meadowbank, a famous collector, and by him it was divided. Search was made for the treasure in its home, but vainly. Travellers did not look in the Indian gardens. No more arrived for many years. Mr. Sander once conceived a fine idea. He sent one of his collectors to gather Loelia anceps alba at the season when it is in bud, with an intention of startling the universe by displaying a mass of them in full bloom. They were still more uncommon then than now, when a dozen flowering plants is still a show of which kings may be proud. Mr. Bartholomeus punctually fulfilled his instructions, collected some 40 plants with their spikes well developed, attached them to strips of wood which he nailed across shallow boxes, and shipped them to San Francisco. Thence they travelled by fast train to New York, and proceeded without a moment's delay to Liverpool on board the Umbria. It was one of her first trips. All went well. Confidently did Mr. Sander anticipate the sensation when a score of those glorious plants were set out in full bloom upon the tables. But on opening the boxes he found every spike withered. The experiment is so tempting that it has been essayed once more with a like result. The buds of Loelia anceps will not stand sea air. Catasetums do not rank as a genus among our beauties. In fact, saving Catasetum pileatum, commonly called C. bungerothi, and C. barbatum, I think of none at this moment which are worthy of attraction on that ground. C. fimbriatum, indeed, would be lovely if it could be persuaded to show itself. I have seen one plant which condescended to open its spotted blooms, but only one. No orchids, however, give more material for study. On this account Catasetum was a favourite with Mr. Darwin. It is approved also by unlearned persons who find relief from the monotony of admiration as they stroll round in observing its acrobatic performances. The column bears 2 horns. If these be touched, the pollen masses fly as if discharged from a catapult. Catasetum pileatum, however, is very handsome, 4 inches across, ivory white, with a round well in the centre of its broad lip, which makes a theme for endless speculation. The daring eccentricities of colour in this class of plant have no stronger example than Catasetum callosum, a novelty from Caracas, with inky brown sepals and petals, brightest orange column, labellum of verdigris green, tipped with orange to match. Schomburgkias are not often seen. Having a boundless choice of fine things which grow and flower without reluctance, the practical gardener gets irritated in these days when he finds a plant beyond his skill. It is a pity, for the Schomburgkias are glorious things, in especial Schomburgkia tibicinis. No description has done it justice, and few are privileged to speak as eyewitnesses. The clustering flowers hang down, sepals and petals of dusky mauve, most gracefully frilled and twisted, encircling a great hollow labellum which ends in a golden drop. That part of the cavity which is visible between the handsome incurved wings has bold stripes of dark crimson. The species is interesting too. It comes from Honduras, where the children use its great hollow pseudo-bulbs as trumpets, whence the name. At their base is a hole, a touch-hole, as we may say, the utility of which defies our botanists. Had Mr. Belt travelled in those parts, he might have discovered the secret, as in the similar case of the bullthorn, one of the gummiferae. The great thorns of that bush have just such a hole, and Mr. Belt proved by lengthy observations that it is designed, to speak roughly, for the ingress of an ant peculiar to that acacia, whose duty it is to defend the young shoots. Vide Belt's Naturalist in Nicaragua, page 218. Importers are too well aware that Schomburgkia tibicinis also is inhabited by an ant of singular ferocity, for it survives the voyage, and rushes forth to battle when the case is opened. We may suppose that it performs a like service. Dendrobiums are warm, mostly. Of the hot species, which are many, and the cool, which are few, I have not to speak here, but a remark made at the beginning of this chapter especially applies to dendrobes. If they be started early, so that the young growths are well advanced by June the 1st, if the situation be warm and a part of the house sunny, if they be placed in that part without any shade till July, and freely syringed, with a little extra attention, many of them will do well enough. That is to say, they will make such a show of blossom as is mighty satisfactory in the winter time. We must not look for specimens, but there should be bloom enough to repay handsomely the very little trouble they give. Among those that may be treated so are Dendrobium wardianum, falconeri, crassinode, pierardii, crystallinum, devonianum, sometimes, and nobile, of course. Probably there are more, but these I have tried myself. Dendrobium wardianum, at the present day, comes almost exclusively from Burma. The neighbourhood of the ruby mines is its favourite habitat, but it was first brought to England from Assam in 1858, when botanists regarded it as a form of Dendrobium falconeri. This error was not so strange as it seems, for the Assamese variety has pseudobulbs much less sturdy than those we are used to see, and they are quite pendulous. It was rather a lively business collecting orchids in Burma before the annexation. The Roman Catholic missionaries established there made it a source of income, and they did not greet an intruding stranger with warmth. Not genial warmth, at least. He was forbidden to quit the town of Barmu, an edict which compelled him to employ native collectors, in fact coolies, himself waiting helplessly within the walls. but his reverend rivals, having greater freedom and an acquaintance with the language, organised a corps of skirmishers to prowl round and intercept the natives returning with their loads. Doubtless somebody received the value when they made a haul, but who is uncertain perhaps, and the stranger was disappointed anyhow. It may be believed that unedifying scenes arose, especially on 2 or 3 occasions when an agent had almost reached one of the 4 gates before he was intercepted. For the hapless collector, having nothing in the world to do, haunted those portals all day long, flying from one to the other in hope to see somebody coming. Very droll, but Burma is a warm country for jests of the kind. Thus it happened occasionally that he beheld his own discomfiture, and rows ensued at the mission house. At length Mr. Sander addressed a formal petition to the Austrian Archbishop, to whom the missionaries owed allegiance. He received a sympathetic answer and some assistance. From the ruby mines also comes a Dendrobium so excessively rare that I name it only to call the attention of employees in the new company. This is Dendrobium rhodopterygium. Sir Trevor Lawrence has, or had, a plant, I believe. There are 2 or 3 at St. Albans, but the lists of other dealers will be searched in vain. Sir Trevor Lawrence also had a scarlet species from Burma, but it died even before the christening, and no second has yet been found. Sumatra furnishes a scarlet dendrobe, D. Forstermanni, but it again is of the utmost rarity. Baron Schroeder boasts 3 specimens, which have not yet flowered, however. From Burma comes Dendrobium Breimerianum, of which the story is brief, but very thrilling if we ponder it a moment, for the missionaries sent this plant to Europe without a description. They had not seen the bloom, doubtless, and it sold cheap enough. We may fancy Mr. Brymer's emotion, therefore, when the striking flower opened. Its form is unique, though some other varieties display a long fringe, as that extraordinary object Nanodes medusae, and also Brassavola digbyana, which is exquisitely lovely sometimes. In the case of Dendrobium Breimerianum, the bright yellow lip is split all round for 2/3 of its expanse into twisted filaments. We may well ask what on earth is nature's purpose in this eccentricity, but it is a question that arises every hour to the most thoughtless being who grows orchids. Everybody knows Dendrobium nobile so well that it is not to be discussed in prose. Something might be done in poetry, perhaps, by young gentlemen who sing of buttercups and daisies, but the rhyme would be difficult. Dendrobium nobile nobilius, however, is by no means so common. Would it were! This glorified form turned up among an importation made by Messrs. Rollisson. They propagated it and sold 4 small pieces, which are still in cultivation. But the troubles of that renowned firm, to which we owe so great a debt, had already begun. The mother plant was neglected. It had fallen into such a desperate condition when Messrs. Rollisson's plants were sold under a decree in bankruptcy, that the great dealers refused to bid for what should have been a little gold mine. A casual market gardener hazarded 30 shillings, brought it round so far that he could establish a number of young plants, and sold the parent for £40 at last. There are, however, several fine varieties of Dendrobium nobile more valuable than nobilius. Dendrobium nobile Sanderianum resembles that form, but it is smaller and darker. Albinos have been found. Baron Schroeder has a beautiful example. One appeared at Stephen's Rooms, announced as the single instance in cultivation, which is not quite the fact, but near enough for the auction room, perhaps. It also was imported originally by Mr. Sander with Dendrobium nobile Sanderianum. Biddings reached £43, but the owner would not deal at the price. Albinos are rare among the dendrobes. Dendrobium nobile Cooksoni was the fons et origo of an unpleasant misunderstanding. It turned up in the collection of Mr. Lang, distinguished by a reversal of the ordinary scheme of colour. There is actually no end to the delightful vagaries of these plants. If people only knew what interest and pleasing excitement attends the inflorescence of an imported orchid, one, that is, which has not bloomed before in Europe, they would crowd the auction rooms, in which every strange face is marked now. There are books enough to inform them, certainly, but who reads an orchid book? Even the enthusiast only consults it. Dendrobium nobile Cooksoni, then, has white tips to petal and sepal. The crimson spot keeps its place, and the inside of the flower is deep red, an inversion of the usual colouring. Mr. Lang could scarcely fail to observe this peculiarity, but he seems to have thought little of it. Mr. Cookson, paying him a visit, was struck, however, as well he might be, and expressed a wish to have the plant. So the two distinguished amateurs made an exchange. Mr. Cookson sent a flower at once to Professor Reichenbach, who, delighted and enthusiastic, registered it upon the spot under the name of the gentleman from whom he received it. Mr. Lang protested warmly, demanding that his discovery should be called after his residence, Heathfieldsianum, but Professor Reichenbach dryly refused to consider personal questions, and really, seeing how short is life and how long Dendrobium nobile Heathfield, etc., true philanthropists will hold him justified. We may expect wondrous dendrobes from New Guinea. Some fine species have already arrived, and others have been sent in the dried inflorescence. Of D. Phalaenopsis Schroederi I have spoken elsewhere. There is D. Goldii, a variety of D. superbiens, but much larger. There is Dendrobius albertii, snow white, D. Broomfieldianum, curiously like Loelia anceps alba in its flower, which is to say that it must be the loveliest of all dendrobes. But this species has a further charm, almost incredible. The lip in some varieties is washed with lavender blue, in some with crimson. Another is nearly related to Dendrobium bigibum, but much larger, with sepals more acute. Its hue is a glorious rosy purple, deepening on the lip, the side lobes of which curl over and meet, forming a cylindrical tube, while the middle lobe, prolonged, stands out at right angles, veined with very dark purple. This has just been named D. Statterianum. It has upon the disc an elevated hairy crest, like D. bigibum, but instead of being white, as always, more or less, in that instance the crest of the new species is dark purple. I have been particular in describing this noble flower, because very, very few have beheld it. Those who live will see marvels when the Dutch and German portions of New Guinea are explored. Recently I have been privileged to see another, the most impressive to my taste, of all the lovely genus. It is called Dendrobium atroviolaceum. The stately flowers hang down their heads, reflexed like a turban lily, 10 or a dozen on a spike. The colour is ivory white, with a faintest tinge of green, and green spots are dotted all over. The lobes of the lip curl in, making half the circumference of a funnel, the outside of which is dark violet blue. With that fine colour the lip itself is boldly striped. They tell me that the public is not expected to catch on to this marvel. It hangs its head too low, and the contrast of hues is too startling. If that be so, we multiply schools of art, and county council lectures perambulate the realm in vain. The artistic sense is denied us. Madagascar also will furnish some astonishing novelties. It has already begun, in fact, with a vengeance. Imagine a scarlet cymbidium. That such a wonder existed has been known for some years, and 3 collectors have gone in search of it. 2 died, and the third has been terribly ill since his return to Europe. But he won the treasure, which we shall behold in good time. Those parts of Madagascar which especially interest botanists must be death traps indeed. M. Leon Humblot tells how he dined at Tamatave with his brother and 6 compatriots, exploring the country with various scientific aims. Within 12 months he was the only survivor. One of these unfortunates, travelling on behalf of Mr. Cutler, the celebrated naturalist of Bloomsbury Street, to find butterflies and birds, shot at a native idol, as the report goes. The priests soaked him with paraffin and burnt him on a table, perhaps their altar. M. Humblot himself has had awful experiences. He was attached to the geographical survey directed by the French government, and 10 years ago he found Phajus Humblotii and Phajus tuberculosus in the deadliest swamps of the interior. A few of the bulbs gathered lived through the passage home,
and caused much excitement when offered for sale at Stephen's auction rooms. M. Humblot risked his life again, and secured a great quantity for Mr. Sander, but at a dreadful cost. He spent 12 months in the hospital at Mayotte, and on arrival at Marseilles with his plants, the doctors gave him no hope of recovery. Phajus Humblotii is a marvel of beauty, rose-pink, with a great crimson labellum, exquisitely frilled, and a bright green column. Everybody who knows his Darwin is aware that Madagascar is the chosen home of the Angraecums. All, indeed, are natives of Africa, so far as I know, excepting the delightful Angraecum falcatum, which comes, strangely enough, from Japan. One cannot but suspect, under the circumstances, that this species was brought from Africa ages ago, when the Japanese were enterprising seamen, and has been acclimatized by those skilful horticulturists. It is certainly odd that the only cool hybridize, the only one found, I believe, outside of India and the eastern tropics, also belongs to Japan, and a cool dendrobe, A. arcuatum, is found in the Transvaal, and I have reason to hope that another or more will turn up when South Africa is thoroughly searched. A pink Angraecum, very rarely seen, dwells somewhere on the west coast, the only species, so far as I know, which is not white. It bears the name of Monsieur du Chaillu, who found it. He has forgotten where, unhappily. I took that famous traveller to St. Albans in the hope of quickening his recollection, and I fear I bored him afterwards with categorical inquiries. But all was vain. Monsieur du Chaillu can only recall that once on a time, when just starting for Europe, it occurred to him to run into the bush and strip the trees indiscriminately. Mr. Sander was prepared to send a man expressly for this Angraecum. The exquisite Angraecum sanderianum is a native of the Comoro Islands. No flower could be prettier than this, nor more deliciously scented, when scented it is. It grows in a climate which travellers describe as paradise, and in truth it becomes such a scene.
Those who behold young plants with graceful garlands of snowy bloom 12 to 20 inches long
are prone to fall into raptures. But imagine it as a long-established specimen appears just now at St. Albans, with racemes drooping 2½ feet from each new growth, clothed on either side with flowers like a double train of white, long-tailed butterflies hovering. Angraecum Scottianum comes from Zanzibar, discovered, I believe, by Sir John Kirk. A. caudatum from Sierra Leone. This latter species is the nearest rival of Angraecum sesquipedale, showing tails 10 inches long. Next in order for this characteristic detail rank A. leonis and Kochii, the latter rarely grown, with 7-inch tails, Scottianum and Elysii with 6-inch. That is to say, they ought to show such dimensions respectively. Whether they fulfil their promise depends upon the grower. With the exceptions named, this family belongs to Madagascar. It has a charming distinction shared by no other genus which I recall, save in less degree Cattleya. Every member is attractive, but I must concentrate myself on the most striking, that which fascinated Darwin. In the first place, it should be pointed out that savants call this plant Airanthus sesquipedalis, not Angraecum, a fact useful to know, but unimportant to ordinary mortals. It was discovered by the Reverend Mr. Ellis, and sent home alive, nearly 30 years ago, but civilized mankind has not yet done wondering at it. The stately growth, the magnificent green-white flowers command admiration at a glance, but the tail or spur offers a problem of which the thoughtful never tire. It is commonly 10 inches long, sometimes 14 inches, and at home I have been told even longer, about the thickness of a goose quill, hollow of course, the last 1.5 inches filled with nectar. Studying this appendage by the light of the principles he had laid down, Darwin ventured on a prophecy which roused special mirth among the unbelievers. Not only the abnormal length of the nectary had to be considered, there was besides the fact that all its honey lay at the base, a foot or more from the orifice. Accepting it as a postulate that every detail of the apparatus must be equally essential for the purpose it had to serve, he made a series of experiments which demonstrated that some insect of Madagascar, doubtless a moth,
must be equipped with a proboscis long enough to reach the nectar, and at the same time thick enough at the base to withdraw the pollinia, thus fertilizing the bloom. For if the nectar had lain so close to the orifice that moths with a proboscis of reasonable length and thickness could get at it, they would drain the cup without touching the pollinia. Darwin never proved his special genius more admirably than in this case. He created an insect beyond belief, as one may say, by the force of logic, and such absolute confidence had he in his own syllogism that he declared, if such great moths were to become extinct in Madagascar, assuredly this Angraecum would become extinct. I am not aware that Darwin's fine argument has yet been clinched by the discovery of that insect, but cavil has ceased. Long before his death, a sphinx moth arrived from South Brazil, which shows a proboscis between 10 and 11 inches long, very nearly equal, therefore, to the task of probing the nectary of Angraecum sesquipedale. And we know enough of orchids at this time to be absolutely certain that the Madagascar species must exist. End of section 8. The second section of chapter 5.